Hi everyone, my name is Dan McCrae and I am the Director of Academic Support at CDL at Empire State College, and tonight we're going to talk about Strength Quest and learn a little bit about positive what strengths are, why you should use them, and how you can use them. So let's see. So one of the things that we tend to do in our society is we tend to spend a lot of time focusing on what we want to fix in ourselves. We want to identify our weaknesses and work on fixing those. And a lot of times, you know, that's a good thing to do, and that's a worthy goal to have. But sometimes I think we can kind of over-focus on fixing our weaknesses, and when we do that, it can kind of hold us up in some areas. One of the things that we've learned from positive psychology and just psychology in general is that when you spend a lot of time just focusing on weaknesses and deficiencies, it's not really a good strategy for motivation or for energy, to energize yourself. And sometimes I think, you know, we have the best intentions of wanting to improve ourselves and to get better at things, but when we do that just by focusing on fixing our weaknesses, we can kind of, you know, sabotage ourselves without even realizing it. So that's one of the reasons I think that Strength Quest and positive psychology in general, studying things like optimism and resiliency and those types of things are really important, because they kind of help give us a more balanced picture about ourselves. One of the things that has kind of illustrated to me how pervasive it is in our society that we focus on weaknesses, and how early this starts for people, was about 6 or 7 years ago. My first daughter, Alexis, was in kindergarten, and I'll tell you a little bit about Alexis before I go too much further, because I kind of want to give you an idea of what she was like, because it helps illustrate the point, I think. So Alexis was she was always really good at communicating. From a very young age, you know, like 18 months old, she had a pretty big vocabulary, and she could speak really well. And, you know, this is my wife and I's first child, so we didn't really, I guess we didn't know what to expect, and so we kind of thought it was normal that, you know, you could have a conversation with an 18-month-old. And so one time our friends came over who also had kids, and they were just kind of blown away that Alexis, you know, the vocabulary that Alexis had, and how she could, you know, hold a conversation and actually understand what you were saying, and, you know, was really good at speaking and communicating. And hold on one second. And so, you know, it really kind of, you know, when we talk to people, and, you know, we kind of started realizing that this was something that this was kind of a gift that Alexis had, it, you know, kind of made us feel good. And we were kind of proud of that. And one of the other things that we learned that Lexi had a gift for was, you know, I guess you'd call it social intelligence. Like, she was really good at making friends and was interested in people and wanted to find out about people. So, you know, in her first couple months of kindergarten, she learned just about every person's name in the classroom, you know, like 30 other students. She learned their first and their last name. And, you know, this kind of thing, you know, really blew me away. It was something I don't think I would have ever even thought to have done, you know, and especially at that young age. It just wouldn't have been a thought in my head to do that. But to her, it just kind of came naturally. She just, you know, was interested in people, and would ask about their, you know, their favorite colors and the favorite TV shows that they like to watch, and if they had brothers and sisters, and what were their brothers and sisters' names, you know. And it was just something that was kind of neat to see. And so it was about, I think, 2 or 3 months into kindergarten, we had our very first parent-teacher conference for Alexis. And so we go into this meeting, and this was kind of coincidentally about the same time that I had learned about Strength Quest and positive psychology. So I think I kind of had, you know, this material in my mind going into the meeting. And because of that, I kind of was waiting for the teacher to tell us about some of the, you know, the strengths that Alexis had and some of the things, the gifts that I saw and my wife saw in Alexis. We kind of expected to talk, at least I thought we would talk a little bit about that. And instead, during the parent-teacher conference, the whole time, the teacher told us about all the things that Alexis was doing wrong in the classroom. You know, she was writing her R's backwards, and she was reversing her 3's, and she was talking too much, and all these things that, you know, Alexis was doing wrong in the classroom. That's all we spent our time talking about. And, you know, these were important things, and my wife and I wanted to know about these things because we wanted to try and you know, help Alexis in these areas so that they weren't problems. But I kept waiting for that moment when the teacher would talk about some of the, you know, strengths and some of the positives that Alexis brought to the classroom, and that moment never came. And, you know, so we ended up leaving. We kind of got rushed out of the meeting. I think it was about 20 or 30 minutes long, and we kind of got rushed out at the end because there were other parents who had to come in for their kids. And I was actually, I think because all this material about Strength Quest was so fresh in my mind, I think it kind of made me angry that, you know, all the teacher focused on were the negatives. And so I turned to my wife and I was like, can you believe that meeting? I mean, I can't believe that. And my wife kind of looked at me strange, and she's like, what are you talking about? It was just like a normal meeting. Like, that's important stuff to know. We need to help Alexis with those things. And I'm like, yeah, but the whole meeting, all we heard about were the bad things that Alexis did. Like, we didn't hear one good thing that Alexis does in that classroom. And my wife was kind of like, wow, yeah, I guess you're right. I hadn't thought of it that way, but, you know, that's true. And so to me, it just kind of brought home how young we start focusing on weaknesses and the negative things in our lives. You know, here she is. It's her second, you know, month in school ever. You know, it's her first time in school, and it's the second month there, and all we're hearing about are these negative things. And so, you know, to me, I think it just shows that, you know, we do need to work on our weaknesses, and we need to know about our weaknesses. But we shouldn't forget that we also have these strengths and talents that can, you know, help energize us and motivate us, and that we need to also remember that we have these resources, these internal resources that we can use to help us be more successful. So Strength Quest comes out of something called positive psychology, and Don Clifton was a researcher. He was one of the first researchers into positive psychology. He was an educational psychologist. He started this about 30 years ago, and at that time, he actually was the CEO of a company called the Gallup Corporation, and this is that company that does the polls and stuff like that, you know, for CNN and for the elections and all those kinds of things. But Gallup is also really interested in education and you know, productivity and management, and what Don Clifton was interested in was how do the people who are the most successful people in whatever field it might be, whether it's business or education or you know, nonprofit side of things, whatever it might be, how did those people get to be in you know, those top positions? What was it that determined who was going to be a top CEO or a top educator in any type of area? And so what he ended up doing was a whole bunch of research. They actually ended up interviewing, I think it ended up being almost 2 million people over the course of 20 or 30 years, tons of people, and they interviewed these people who were really successful. They also interviewed people who were kind of successful, but they weren't at the top of their game, and they also interviewed people who were like underachievers, so they weren't all that successful. And what they found is that the people who were the most successful, the CEOs and the top salespeople and the top, executives in whatever organization they were looking at, those people were very aware of their talents. And if you asked them what their talents were, they could very easily tell you, what the top 3 things they thought were their strengths and talents. They could name them to you. The people who were successful, but they weren't at the top of the game, those people, they usually couldn't name their talents. And that was the same for people who weren't very successful. Both those groups of people, they weren't really aware of their talents. If you asked them what their talents were, they'd say, well, I don't think I really have any talents, or I'm not sure what my talents are, things like that. And so when they ended up looking at all the different interviews of the really successful people, they found that there were about, I think it was something like 400 different talents that they were able to identify in all those interviews. And when they did a factor analysis and they looked for the talents that made the biggest impact on whether or not that person was successful, they found that there were 34 talents that did the best job of explaining why those people were successful. And so Don Clifton developed an assessment called the Strengths Finder that helps people identify their top 5 talents out of those 34 talents. And so this is really, it's a really important thing, because a lot of times, and I think this is true for me, when I took the Strengths Finder assessment, I was one of those people, I didn't really think I had any talents. It was kind of like, I don't know what my talents are. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm good at like writing maybe. I don't know, and so I think once I took the assessment and I saw what my top 5 talents were, it was kind of like, it gave me language to talk about these things that I kind of knew about, but I didn't really have, it was almost like I didn't have the words for it. So it kind of helped give me some language that I could use to think about these things and to talk about these things. And once you are aware of your talents and know what they are, you can start working on them and developing them. And so that's the key word here, and that's kind of like one of the most important things that they have found from the research, is that it's not really enough just to identify your talents. You also have to use your talents and develop your talents so that they can become strengths. And that's something that I think is super important. So I'll talk a little bit about the difference between a talent and a strength. So they're pretty similar, but basically a talent is something that we're kind of born with. It kind of comes natural to us. It's something that we don't have to learn, we just know it. So for example, my daughter Alexis, she was just good at communicating. She just had a natural ability to communicate really well from a very young age. And so I don't think I really gave her, taught her that talent. I think it just kind of came naturally to her. I hopefully helped develop that in her, but I don't think you could say that I taught that to her. And so one of the things about talents is that because they show up when we're really young, a lot of times we don't really have good control of our talents. And so because we don't have really good control over them, a lot of times those are the things that get us into trouble. So Alexis got in trouble a lot in class for talking, because she was just really good at it, and it just kind of came naturally to her, and she would talk to her friends, and excuse me, sometimes that would get her into trouble. So for me, I think probably one of the things that definitely got me in trouble when I was younger, when I was in elementary school, I remember, was that I always got in trouble for not paying attention and kind of daydreaming, looking out the window and daydreaming and those kinds of things. And so that talent, I think, has to do with the fact that I like to think about things, and I have a couple talents that kind of go along those lines, and one of them is called ideation. That means I like to think about things and kind of come up with new ideas and think about how ideas are related and those kinds of things. And I think that definitely got me into trouble a lot, because instead of listening to the teacher, I would be looking out the window and thinking about whatever it was I was thinking about. So a strength is different from a talent, but they're very similar. And sometimes I go back and forth, and so I kind of use talent and strength interchangeably, but maybe I shouldn't, but I just do. But a strength is like a talent that you have develop to a high level. So it's something that you're able to use on a consistent basis at a high level of performance. So it's kind of like a talent that you've kind of supercharged. You've developed it and used it and really spent time and made it something that you can control and use at a high level. So that's the difference between the two things. So what I want you to think about now, and maybe this will show up when you take the assessment, or maybe it won't. Sometimes people have more talents than show up in the assessment. But what I want you to think about now is what were the things that you got in trouble for as a kid? And like when you were in school, what were the things that the teacher yelled at you about? So think about that and see if you can come up with anything. And you can, if you want to talk in your microphone, that's great. I actually love that. But if you don't want to talk into your microphone, you can type it into the chat box.
I always found myself getting in trouble because I was bored and I was doing something other than what I was supposed to be.
Okay. So you weren't paying attention and were kind of doing your own thing?
Yeah, I was bored in school. I didn't like being there, and would do other things to keep myself busy.
Okay, cool. So Connie didn't get in trouble because she was in Catholic school. I spent a couple years in Catholic school, so I can understand that, Connie. Those nuns don't mess around for sure. Anyone else? Okay. Amanda got in trouble for talking a lot. Okay, yep. That one definitely, I think lots of people have had that problem. All right, so a lot of times, I think because we don't, this is one of those things where this is one of the things that kind of makes it hard for us to identify our talents, because when you get in trouble for something, like on a regular basis, so if you get in trouble for talking in class a lot, then you're not going to think of communicating and talking to other people as a strength or as a positive thing. You're going to think of it as a negative thing. And so, and for me, that was definitely the case for me as well. So I learned that, daydreaming and thinking about things was, that was something I had to I didn't think of it as a talent. I thought of that as definitely something that was a weakness. It was something that I got in trouble for. So it was something I had to kind of not focus on, not look at, not spend time on, because that was the thing that got me in trouble. And so I think this is something I think that Don Clifton found a lot with the people that he interviewed, that one of the reasons they couldn't identify their talents is because the things that they were actually talented in were things that they got in trouble for a lot. So it was kind of like their mental frame of reference was that it was a weakness. And hold on, my light just keeps going out, so hold on. Okay, so one of the things about talents and strengths that's important, and that I think I think we don't really understand this very well. We don't realize it very often. Is that our talents and strengths are also the things that energize us, and that's why talents and strengths are really important for motivation. So, excuse me. So, Bill Gates is a great example of someone who is. He has a lot of talents. He's a really good businessman. Obviously he's like one of the richest people in the world, so obviously he's good at business. But the thing that he's really motivated by and energized by is doing software design. Designing programs, programming things. That's the thing that really kind of energizes him. So even though he's really good at like finance and accounting and marketing and all those kinds of things, he finds that if he spends all his time doing that, he ends up going home at the end of the day and he just feels wiped out. You know, he has no energy. He's very tired and just exhausted from spending all his time doing those kinds of things. But when he spends time working on his programming and software development, he finds that that's really what energizes him and gets him, you know, excited to go to work. And, you know, it got so to the point where he actually decided he was going to let his partner, Steve Ballmer, take over the business side of things. And he was just going to focus on the software development because that's what energized him. And Steve Ballmer was going to focus on the business side of things in Microsoft because that's where his strengths were. So I think that's a really good example because you know, one of the most important things about our strengths is that they're a huge source of energy and motivation for us, and so that's why I think it's important to learn about them for us. So another thing about strengths is that when we learn about our strengths and we learn about you know, how to start using them and developing them, it's kind of like a more direct path to success because we learn about our strengths and it ends up helping us build confidence and motivation through hard work and you know, putting our strengths into use, and that leads us kind of just much more directly. Whoops, went too far. Much more direct line kind of to achieving success. And sometimes it's almost like when you see it, you know, in front of you, it's almost too obvious. It's like, yeah, of course, you know, working on your strengths will lead to success. But a lot of times that's the opposite of what we do. We end up working only on our weaknesses and expect that to lead to success. So it's important to have a balance and to know about our strengths as well as our weaknesses. And when we work on our strengths, when we're aware of our strengths and we develop them, it just is a much more direct path to being successful. So one of the things that I think is a really important point, and I kind of go back to this a lot in the workshop, is that the hard work is a really key piece of developing your strengths. Like, it's not enough just to identify your strength. It's also about putting the hard work in. And Angela Duckworth, she has done a lot of work into something called grit. And grit is basically persistence and passion for a long-term goal. So it's someone, it's kind of like a quality where we're able to work on a long-term goal for sustained amounts of time. So for a long, long time, if we work on, say we want to, you know, become a musician, you know, that takes a lot of grit. It takes time and patience and the ability to kind of stick with something for a long period of time. That's what grit is. And when you identify your strengths and it helps, you know, increase your motivation, it's a way that we can kind of develop grit. It helps us to become gritty when we know what our strengths are and we have the motivation to work on something. It can kind of help us with becoming more gritty. And grit is important because what Angela Duckworth has found, she's a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania, and she has found that in her research, she's researched cadets at West Point and people who compete in spelling bees, and she's looked at students in school, and she found that in all those different situations, having grit, or you know, being able to persist for a long amount of time at a long-term goal, was a better predictor of success than intelligence was. And so that kind of goes against what we normally think. We normally think that having a high IQ is the most important ingredient in being successful at school, or in being, you know, successful at competing in a spelling bee or something like that. Or even in work, you know, we think that that's the most important quality for our jobs. And actually what Angela Duckworth found is that persistence and sticking with something was actually a better predictor of whether or not you were going to be successful. She also found that creativity, so it wasn't just grit, but it was also having a knowledge about your strengths and having creativity and sometimes just plain old luck. All of those kind of went into why we were successful. It wasn't just one thing. So, but I think the important piece here is that when we learn about our strengths, it can kind of help us develop that grit and that persistence. And this is kind of what I just said. So, learning about our strengths helps us develop our passion and motivation, which leads to grit and hard work. So Strength Quest comes out of something called positive psychology, and it's kind of been, positive psychology has kind of been a reaction against traditional mainstream psychology. Mainstream psychology kind of focuses on the negative side of human nature, focuses on things like depression and anxiety and trauma, things that cause problems for us. And that's, there's nothing wrong with that. That's actually really important that psychology does that. But what Martin Seligman, who was one of the founders along with Don Clifton of positive psychology, what Martin Seligman realized is that when psychologists only focus on those things, they kind of get a distorted view of human functioning. And it's also important to focus on the things that we do well and the things that make life worth living, so that we can kind of get a more balanced and a fuller picture of human nature. So Martin Seligman started positive psychology in 1999, and positive psychology is just kind of the study of optimal human functioning, flourishing, how people, how groups, and how institutions flourish. What are the things that lead to that? And so one of the main reasons that Martin Seligman developed positive psychology was when they looked at the number of research articles, and this was in 1990, I think it was 96 or 97. They did this research study, and they looked at all the psychology articles that had been published in research journals. So any research journal that published psychology articles, they looked at all of them. And they found that for every 21 articles that were done on like depression, anxiety, trauma, there was one article that was done on human flourishing, some aspect of the positive side of humanity. So it was very lopsided, and it was very slanted towards the negative side of human nature. And so he kind of decided that he was going to also remind psychology that there was another side to human nature, that there was the optimism and resiliency, and that those things were important to research as well, and that we could learn important kind of life-changing things from the positive side of human nature. So he kind of made that his mission, and he actually he was elected the president of the American Psychological Association in 2000, and he had started his work already. Martin Seligman is a pretty interesting guy. He actually is the psychologist who discovered learned helplessness. And so learned helplessness is when humans can be taught to give up, basically. Even in situations where there's a very obvious way for them to get out of a bad situation, if you teach someone to be helpless, that their actions don't matter, you can actually, put them in a situation where there's an obvious exit to get out of that bad situation, and they won't take that exit because they just don't think it matters. And he called this learned helplessness, which was pretty revolutionary back then when he did his research. I think it was in the 60s and 70s when he started his research. But one of the other really important things he discovered is that not only can you teach people to be helpless, you can also teach people to be optimistic. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm missing some of the chats down here. That's great, Amanda. Yeah. So what I think what you're talking about, positive thinking, is similar to positive psychology, but there are some differences. I think I didn't read that particular book, so I can't speak to that book. But one of the main focuses of positive psychology is that they really focus on empirical research, so on scientific studies. So they don't just look at, I think one of the critiques of kind of positive thinking is that it wasn't really based on science. I think a lot has gone on since then that have kind of backed up, I think, what's in that book. And it's actually kind of the foundation of what Martin Seligman found about teaching people to be optimistic is a really important part of that is changing how you think and changing, kind of being aware of the messages that you give yourself kind of when you talk to yourself, and kind of disputing the negative messages and the kind of disempowering messages, and using evidence to kind of change your thinking. So they're similar, but I think they're also slightly, I guess positive psychology is probably maybe a more modern version of positive thinking. But yeah, it's along the same lines, I think. So they're good. I'm glad you have some. Yeah, they're very similar, but I think there are some differences. And I think the main difference is that positive psychology is just more, it's a more recent phenomena that's more kind of grounded in science and research studies. But anyways, they're both good, I think. So this is just one of the studies where they looked at publication trends in research journals. And so this just illustrates really well. Up here, the blue line is our research articles that have been done on depression and research psychology journals. The purple line is on anxiety. And all the way down there at the bottom, if you look, there's a little tiny white line, and it doesn't even show up until about 1998. And then, it goes up a little bit in 2003. But if, that just kind of starkly illustrates how much time and energy psychologists spend on focusing on kind of the negative sides of humanity. And it has gotten a little bit better in the last few years, maybe in the last 10 years. There are now like 2 or 3 journals that are dedicated to positive psychology and that publish pretty regularly about human strengths and flourishing. But it's still pretty lopsided. It's still, I don't know if it's not anywhere near the levels that people publish journal articles on the negative side. So it just kind of is a interesting illustration of that. So these are some of the areas that positive psychology, where they study, what kind of subjects they study. So talents and strengths, attachment, optimism, love, emotional intelligence, intrinsic motivation, wisdom, character strengths, gratitude, forgiveness, awe, inspiration, hope, curiosity, meditation, mindfulness, savoring, journaling. So all these different subjects have been pretty much ignored for the last couple hundred years by science, because most of these subjects, scientists used to think, that they weren't something that you could study, that you couldn't really measure a talent or a strength, and you really couldn't, happiness or emotional intelligence just seemed too kind of like nebulous, and it was something where they couldn't study it, and so it's only been in the last 15 years, I think, that people have finally realized that, you actually can do science on these things and learn from these things in a way that is grounded in empirical fact. Let's see. So an important important reason, I guess, why learning about our strengths and our talents is that when we learn about our strengths and talents, it helps spark those positive emotions. And positive emotions, we've found, actually, positive emotions like happiness and I guess happiness is the best word right now. Optimism, I guess, is another word I was trying to think of. But those two things, optimism and happiness, actually are one of the causes of success. So for years and years and years, we've thought that, you know, if you work hard, you'll be successful, and when you are successful, that will lead to happiness. And they've done a whole bunch of research and have found that it's actually that we've got it backwards, that actually happiness precedes success, and happiness is the cause of success, which kind of goes against everything that we've been taught and everything we've kind of just think, you know, common sense, you know, it doesn't, it's not intuitive to us. But the research shows that when you are, if someone is happy, they're much more likely to be successful. There's a great study, it's called a meta-analysis, and it's done by a group of psychologists from, where are they from? So one of them is from Harvard. I think Sonia Lyubomirsky is from Harvard, and they're all from major research universities. And they ended up doing this huge study that looked at 275,000 people. So this was a huge study, and they looked at longitudinal studies, which is where you follow people over time, over a long period of time, usually a year, sometimes it's many years. They looked at experimental studies where there was a control group and random assignment between a control group and a treatment group. And they also looked at studies that were similar to experimental but not quite that rigorous. They were semi-random, I guess, semi-experimental. And in all those studies, they found that if a person was happy, that was a better predictor of their success in terms of like what caused their success. So one of the studies they looked at was on salespeople, and they found that if you had a higher level of happiness, you were like 50% more, would have 50% more sales than someone who was pessimistic, basically. So this was a huge study, and it really kind of highlighted how important happiness and positive emotions are. And that's one of the reasons I think that identifying your strengths and talents is so important, because that kind of leads to those positive emotions that are so important. So here's some of the other things that they found in this study, that doctors who were in a positive mood showed they were 3 times more creative and were able to make better diagnoses 19% faster than doctors who were in a neutral state. So they weren't necessarily sad, but they were just kind of neutral. This is the thing I was talking about with salespeople. They also found that students who were primed to feel happy before taking a math test actually scored better on the math test. And then a really interesting study that shows kind of how important our focus is was where they took, in this study they had bowlers, and these people were kind of new to bowling. They weren't expert bowlers, and they were randomly assigned either to a group where so all the bowlers were videotaped, and one group they've spliced together all the mistakes that the bowler made, and then they showed the bowler that video after they had bowled. So one group was randomly assigned to that group where they were just shown their mistakes. The other set of bowlers, the other group, they were shown a video of only the things that they did right in the bowl while they bowled. And the group who was shown just the things that they did well, and they weren't shown any of the mistakes they made, they actually scored higher. I think it was 10. They scored 10 points higher on average than the group that was just shown the negative things that they did, the mistakes they made. So again, it kind of goes against intuitive kind of common sense. That people think, well, I have to know how I'm making mistakes so that I can improve those. I can stop making those mistakes. Well, this study, they actually showed that that's not necessarily true, and that sometimes if you just focus on the things that you do well and the things that you're doing right, that actually leads to better performance. So that was a really important and interesting study. So there are some like physiological reasons why this stuff is important. So for the fight or flight response is something that happens to us whenever we're in a situation that's a threat to us. And this could be a physical threat, like if a car is coming close to us on the road, and it looks like it's going to hit us. That's a physical threat. But also like a psychological threat, like taking a test or writing an essay, a really difficult essay or something. That psychological threat kind of generates the same response in us. So our blood rate goes up, our blood pressure goes up, we have stress hormones that go through our body. All these things happen physiologically that kind of prepare us to either fight or to run away, basically. And that's called the fight or flight response. And it's been known now for about 100 years. We know that this is a physiological response. We don't really, we can't consciously control it. It just happens when something threatens us. So Barbara Fredrickson was interested in how our positive emotions affect the fight or flight response. So kind of like one of the negative effects of the fight or flight response is that when we have it activated too often, so basically even for hours after the threat has disappeared and we're not in danger anymore, all those physiological things that came from the fight or flight response still affect us. So like 2 or 3 hours after the threat is gone and everything is fine, our blood rate is still higher, our heart rate is still up, we still have the stress hormones going through our body, and if that kind of continues for a prolonged period of time, it can actually make you sick. You can get, your immune system gets worn out and you actually get sick. And so Barbara Fredrickson wanted to know, she is a researcher, and I think she's at University of Michigan, and she wanted to know how does positive emotions affect the flight or fight response. And so what they did was they measured all those things that happen to us in the fight or flight response, like our blood rate and our heart rate and all those different, and the stress hormones, all those different physiological markers. They were measuring them, and then they produced a positive emotion like laughter. And they found that laughter instantly reduces your blood rate, reduces your blood pressure, and kind of gets rid of those stress hormones, kind of washes those stress hormones out of your system. And it does it faster than any drug we know. And so she actually calls this the broaden and build effect. And this is like kind of the power that positive emotion has. And so, for hundreds of years, we've known why we've had the fight or flight response. But in all that time, researchers haven't really looked at why do we have positive emotions? Why do we have happiness? They just kind of thought that it was this kind of extra, nebulous thing that doesn't really matter and that you can't really learn anything from. And what we know now is that no, positive emotions actually are important, biologically and physiologically, because they undo the negative effects of the fight or flight response and all those, the physiological things that happen to us from that. So another thing she found is that not only do positive emotions help us biologically, they also help us psychologically. So when we're in a good mood, we actually think better and we're better problem solvers than when we're in a bad mood. And so she did an experiment. This is also a really interesting experiment where people were randomly assigned to either go watch a drama, a movie that was kind of heavy and intense, where when you left the movie you weren't in a good mood, you were kind of in a bad mood when you left that movie. And then another group of people were assigned to go watch a comedy. Excuse me. And at the end of the movie, they interviewed both groups, and they asked them one question. They said, I want you to write down as many things that you can think to do right now at this moment, like, go ride a bike or read a book or, whatever it is. And so the group that went to go see the drama, they could come up with about 5 things on average that they could think to do. the group that went to go see the comedy, they could come up with between 25 and 30 things that they could do at that moment. So they were 5 times more creative, and they were able to generate many more alternatives than the people who were in a bad mood. So again, it just shows that our positive emotions not only help us biologically, physiologically, but it also helps us psychologically. And so that's one of the reasons why Strength Quest, I think, is so important, and that's kind of why I'm telling you guys all this stuff, because when you become aware of your strengths and you start using your strengths, it leads to all these positive effects that I've been talking about. More creativity, better thinking. They've done studies that have shown that people who use their strengths are more likely to achieve their goals than people who don't use their strengths. They have higher GPAs, they have higher grade point averages, they're more likely to stay in school and finish school than people who aren't aware of their strengths. So there's lots of, all the psychological reasons that I talked about, and also reasons, like, whether or not you can finish something, and this has to do with, I think, with our motivation and our energy levels, and our ability to kind of stick with something when things aren't that easy and can get difficult. So that's why I think Strength Quest is so important. So any questions about what I've talked about so far? I know I've been kind of talking now for a long time, I feel like. So questions or comments? And John, I see that you were. Yeah, I think definitely society has a negative slant, I think, a lot of times, and that's an unfortunate thing. And I think that's also, I think, why Strength Quest is important, because it kind of helps remind us that there is another side, that there is a good side to human nature, and that we do have these strengths and talents, and that we should focus on them as well. Any other comments or questions? Well, okay, so that's a great question, Amanda. So Amanda is asking, what if something makes us unhappy? Should you try to find the happiness in it, so the positive side to it? Well, so what I would, I guess positive psychology, I think one of the things that is important is that it's not, and this is maybe how it's a little bit different from positive thinking. So if something is bad, if you're in a bad situation, I think positive thinking would say, well, you should try and, just change how you think about that and try and pretend like you're happy. And positive psychology would say, well, no, maybe we're not saying that you should pretend that you're happy when you're not really happy. If something is going on that is a bad situation, then you need to face it. I think what positive psychology would say is that, you can use these strengths to try and either make that situation better, to do something about that situation, or maybe to leave that situation. So I don't think it's a matter, I think for sure positive psychology wouldn't say, look for the good side of that situation. It would say, well, how can you use your strengths or your resiliency to make that situation better? Does that help at all, Amanda? Okay. So it looks like Connie. Yeah. So John's saying yes, Eddie Murphy. So Eddie Murphy and essays are good. Yeah, I think they've actually done studies where they have shown people like funny videos on YouTube and had them perform an academic task afterwards, and they found that those people actually do perform better academically, when they're in a good mood. So yes, I think Eddie Murphy and writing essays is a good thing. So maybe you want to, watch Eddie Murphy before you write the essay, though, so not while you're writing it. So how can you identify your strengths? That's a great question, Connie. And so let me talk about that now. So the whole reason that we're doing this workshop tonight is because there is this thing called the StrengthsFinder assessment. It's an online assessment. I'm going to give you a code, and you're going to go to this website, strengthquest.com, and you're going to take an assessment. It takes about 25 to 30 minutes for most people. Some people who kind of take their time and maybe aren't comfortable with computers or whatever. They might take a little bit longer. I've never seen anyone, and I've given this assessment to hundreds and hundreds of students, probably thousands of students, and it's never taken longer than 45 minutes in the time that I've been doing this. So most people take about 25 minutes, I would guess. And at the end of the assessment, it tells you what your top 5 talents are out of those 34 talents that I was talking about. And so once you identify your talents, it gives you a description of each talent, a pretty in-depth description, and you'll get a website, your own personalized website with this StrengthQuest book that goes into more detail about the talents and strengths. And it also, one of the great things about the website is that for each talent, they give you activities that you can do to develop your talents into strengths. And so that's kind of the key thing. And I actually, the stuff that I shared with you tonight, there's a couple worksheets in there. The first worksheet is, help kind of listing your talents and then coming up with a plan of how you're going to develop those talents. And so you can use those worksheets, and I think those are, you don't have to use them, but I think they just help you kind of come up with a plan and think about how are you going to develop these talents. And so the StrengthQuest website, your own personal website, will have all 5 of your talents, and underneath each talent, they'll have action items. And they have action items for school, they have action items for work, for relationships. I think there are a couple other areas, but they have all these different areas, and they have different things that you can do to develop your talent in those different areas. So the worksheets, you should have downloaded them when you came into to collaborate tonight. Did you get the worksheets when you first, a window should have popped up to ask you if you want to download something? Did that happen when you came in, Amanda? Okay, let me see. Give me one sec. So, okay, so here's the first one.
Okay, perfect.
Did the window come up? Okay, and here's the second one. So those are the 2 worksheets. This is the slides from tonight's presentation, and one of the main reasons I shared that with you is because there's a lot of resources I gave at the end, like videos and articles and books. So if you're interested and you want to read more about that, you can do that. And this is a research article. And this is and if you already got this, you can just cancel. You don't have to download it twice. But so those are all the resources that I have for you. And then, like I said, at the end of the presentation, the end of the slides, there's a whole bunch of works cited that you can do some more research in if you want to. So anyways, the assessment. Sure, you're welcome. Okay, I'm glad you told me. So because I think that's definitely important stuff. I want you guys to have that. So the assessment, like I said, it takes about 20 minutes. I think there are roughly 80 questions, and I shouldn't call them questions, but what they're having you do, they give you 2 different statements. So one thing might say, I like to ride bikes. And on the same page, you'll have another statement that says, I like to read books. And so you have to decide which one of those things describes you better. Do you like to ride bikes more, or do you like to read books more? So, most people like one or the other a little bit more. If you really can't decide, and you really love to read books, and you really love to ride bikes, then you can choose neutral. But most people, I would say, go with your gut instinct, like kind of, think about it, make a decision, click on your decision, and then you can think a little bit more afterwards. But so the thing is that they give you, I think, 15 to 20 seconds for each question, because they want your gut response. They don't want you to think too long and go back and forth. So you get about 20 seconds for each question. You pick your choice, and then either you go on to the next thing, or if you take too long, it'll just go ahead. It'll jump ahead for you. But don't worry about it if it jumps ahead, because the questions will come back around usually, and even if you miss one or two, it doesn't make that much of a difference. But anyways, if you really don't like either one of those things, then you can choose neutral. And if you really can't decide between them both because you like both of them the same, then choose neutral. I would say, just be careful about choosing neutral too much, because if you choose neutral too often, a little warning window will come up, and it'll say, we can't really determine what your strengths are because we can't tell what your preferences are because you're choosing neutral too often. So even if you have just a slight preference for one or the other, choose that slight preference and go with that. And you can choose, like, you like it a little bit or you like it a lot, on each side. So so after you do that, after you take the assessment, it'll tell you what your top 5 talents are, and you'll be able to log into the website, and you'll see and they have, one of the cool things about the website is that they're always adding new stuff to it. So I know they have like a journal, a place where you can kind of keep a journal about your strength development. They have different kind of resources and activities that you can do. I think the most important things are the action items. And you can actually print out the action items, and they have so they'll have a whole list of like maybe 20 or 30 different action items. And you can read through them, and if you really like one, you can kind of click on it, and there's like a little checkbox next to it, and you can check on it, and then you'll be able to print, and you can print out just the things that you made the check mark on, and you can use that to kind of develop your talents. Yes, so there's a code. And right now what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop the recording,